Thank you for joining us today. I am Denis Mwauda, the Assistant Director at Gallery 400 at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm glad to have everyone here. Our guests tonight are Jennifer Brier, Gregg Bordowitz, Dan Berger, and Debra Fleming. And this is our final program that is related to our exhibition, Reckless Rolodex, which closes on Saturday. The exhibition celebrates the legacy of Lawrence Steger, who was a Chicago-based performance artist during the 80s and the 90s. Lawrence explored sexuality and desire until his death in 1999 due to HIV complications. And so it felt important to close our exhibition programming with a conversation from researchers, educators, people living with HIV and AIDS to really consider how our cultural perceptions and also in generally how their experiences have changed since the 80s. And so tonight we also have captioning as well. I want to offer a couple of access invitations, so please do whatever you need to do to be comfortable in this space. You're welcome to have your camera on or off, even if your camera is on. Feel free to move and join from a comfy spot. Have something to eat, move around, leave, and come back, whatever you need to be comfortable. Like I mentioned, we also have closed captioning available. You can access them by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom and selecting show subtitles. That's also where you can turn them off if you want. And we'll have a Q&A at the end of our conversation where you can engage with our speakers tonight by making a comment or a question in the chat that we can read out. We can read it out loud. You can also unmute and you can speak out, or you can also use the hand raise function at the bottom of your screen. I just ask everyone to be loud and be mindful of your volume and pace so that we can hear you, including the caption. And so before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge the relationship to the land we are on today. The broader city of Chicago, named after the Algonquin name for the river whose shores were lined with wild leeks, was and continues to be an indigenous place. Owing to the multiple waterways that converge here, Chicago is the ancestral homeland of the Three Fires Council, consisting of the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, in addition to Miami, Illinois, Inuka, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee nations. Today, Chicago has the third largest urban Native population in the United States, with more than 65,000 Native Americans in the greater metropolitan area. The American Indian Center in Albany Park, founded in 1953, in the era of relocation, remains the oldest urban Indian center in the country. I hope to not merely acknowledge the land we're upon as a performative gesture, but also invite us to call into relation these lands, histories, and nations. They've not ceased to exist. I also want to acknowledge the significant work that the University of Illinois, Chicago and Gallery 400 has yet to do in honoring these relations and rectifying this colonial past with other struggles. These Americas are built on violence and erasure, and we bring these histories with us, those native to this land, indigenous people from other territories, as well as white settlers by conquest, and those of us who've come here by force or otherwise as a result of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and ongoing wars. When entering any space, especially virtual spaces, we must bring these histories into view, and with this acknowledgement, we meet here in hopes of a different world making. So tonight's program will focus on a variety of topics ranging from oral histories and narratives around HIV and AIDS. We'll also get to hear about Gregg's personal memories of Lawrence Steger. And we'll also get to hear about progress in research around HIV treatment and antiretroviral treatments as well. We'll also get to hear about Jenny Brier's project, I'm Still Surviving, and how, and about Chicago activism, Chicago AIDS activism during the 80s and the 90s. So our speakers tonight are Jennifer Brier, professor of gender, women's studies, and history at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she also directs the program in gender and women's studies. She specializes in U.S. history of sexuality and gender, the history of HIV and AIDS, and public history. She's the author of Infectious Ideas, U.S. Political Response to the AIDS Crisis, which was published in 2009. She guest edited and contributed to the HIV and AIDS in U.S. History, Interchange, and the Journal of American History in September 2017. And this was the first feature-length piece on the subject to appear in the journal. Brier is at work on a major public history project called History Moves, a community-curated mobile gallery that provides a space for Chicago-based community organizers and activists to share their histories with a wide audience. And since 2015, History Moves has also partnered with the Women's Interagency HIV Study to collect and curate the stories of nearly 40 women living with HIV and AIDS in a multimedia project titled I'm Still Surviving. We also have Debra Fleming, who is a community activist who's been HIV positive since 1985. Debra has served as a chair for the Chicago area planning groups, has been a board member for the National AIDS Housing Coalition, is a motivational speaker with the Chicago Women's AIDS Project, Imani Nia Theater, and rap group. We're also joined by Gregg Bordowitz, who is an artist, writer, and for the past 3 years, Bordowitz turned his attention to performance. Testing Some Beliefs is an improvisational lecture that he delivered at Iceberg Projects, Murray Guy in New York, Temple Gallery in Philadelphia, and the Museum of Modern Art of Fort Worth, Texas. He wrote and directed Sex Mitigating Death on Discourses and Drives, a meditative poem presented March 18, 2011 at the Tate Modern in London. He's also directed and written an opera titled The History of Sexuality, Volume 1 by Michel Foucault, an opera which premiered in 2010 at the Tanzquarter Wiener in Austria. His most recent book, General Idea, Image Virus, was published by After All Books in 2010. A collection of his writings include The AIDS Crisis is Ridiculous and Other Writings, 1986 to 2003, which was published by MIT Press in the fall of 2004. Gregg is now director of the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program in New York. And we are also joined by Daniel S. Berger, who is a leading HIV specialist in the US. He is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Illinois and founder of North Star Medical, the largest private HIV treatment and research center in the greater Chicago area. Dr. Berger is well known for nationally and internationally among researchers and individuals engaged in HIV drug development. He has published more than 70 articles and abstracts in peer-reviewed medical journals and international conferences on antiretroviral therapy and other HIV-related treatment. He has also conducted more than 200 HIV-related clinical research trials and published extensively in medical journals, including Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. He is the recipient of the Visual AIDS Vanguard Award in New York for his exceptional work as an HIV specialist. Also has a great passion for art and legacy of art, AIDS activism as a collector and curator, archivist, and philanthropist. As an active patron of the arts in 2010, Dr. Berger founded Iceberg Projects, which is located in Rogers Park, as an alternative exhibition space in Chicago. And so now please welcome our guest today with a warm round of applause. And so I'll start off with talking to you, Gregg, about, or start off thinking about our exhibition Reckless Rolodex. When I reached out to you about this program, I wasn't aware about your connection to Lauren Steger. which Reckless Rolodex centers on. And so you told me that the two of you met in Chicago during the 80s when you were visiting for an for an AIDS conference. And I was hoping that you could tell us about your memory of him and also about your shared love for Jean Genet. Oh, you're muted, Greg.
Yeah, I'm muted. Sorry. Thank you, Denny, for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be here. My memory of the AIDS conference, I don't know, Dan or Jenny, if you were there, but in the late 80s, there was a really big AIDS activist conference at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And a lot of us from New York, at that time I was living in New York and doing work with ACT UP in New York, came to Chicago and met with activists from around the country. And there was a day or two of panel discussions and smaller groups about what Douglas Crimp, art historian and theorist, called cultural analysis and cultural activism around AIDS. And it kind of blends, my memory kind of blends in with a lot of other conferences. They're all special, but they also at some point 30 years later kind of blend together. But what was special about this was that I did get to meet some folks who remained in my life and had connections with members of Chicago ACT UP and like Mary Patton, for example, who I actually did work with, Ferd Egan, Deborah Gould, all very important AIDS activists who were part of ACT UP Chicago. And I also met lots of artists, and one of them was Larry Steger. I called him Larry. I can't remember if he preferred Lawrence or Larry, but I always remember calling him Larry. And we, just kind of kept in touch whenever I would return to Chicago. Eventually, I moved to Chicago in 1997 to teach at the School of the Art Institute for 25 years, which I just concluded, actually, by taking this job back in New York, where I am now. But I was in Chicago for a very long time. And so, Larry and I had the ongoing conversations about being people with HIV and also being artists, making work about queer subjects and HIV. Yeah, I mean, I actually was on part of a very large group house on Fire Island, and Larry came and stayed with me with his boyfriend at the time. And so, we just had this ongoing, I wouldn't say we were very close friends, but we were friends and we knew each other for a long time, and we were also in conversation about art. And so you asked me about Genet. I think it's really interesting that that was one of the things that I remember most clearly. Sometime in the 90s, Larry was working on a project about Jean Genet, the French writer. And I feel like I have to explain who Genet was, because many people haven't read Genet, but also it seems to me like a generational thing. I actually don't know how many people read Jean Genet now, but Jean Genet was a very important literary figure who wrote actually in the mid 20th century up until the early 1980s. Larry and I were interested in Genet because he's a queer hero, literary hero, and outlaw. Jean Genet was self-identified homosexual and thief. He wrote his first book incarcerated, The Thieves' Journal. And he's a very important literary figure because he was very open about depicting queer sexualities and was an outlaw, but also an extraordinarily gifted writer and subversive. and had very interesting politics. So Genet was a hero to a lot of people I knew, especially queer folks. The one thing that's important to understand about Genet, I guess, and why Larry and I and many, many other people gravitated to Jean Genet was that Genet had what some critics have called a negative moral universe, which can be simply explained as that he inverted the world. So saints are sinners. People who are thought of as saints are sinners, and sinners, people who are thought of as sinners are saints, basically. And he was a champion of the oppressed and ostracized, and the colonized. The last book that Jean Genet wrote was Prisoner of Love, which came out, I think, in French in 1980 and came out in English somewhere around 1987. So it was the early 80s it came out, and a lot of us, I don't really read French, were very excited when it came out in English. And it was exciting because Genet, who was a very well-known novelist and playwright in the early 1970s, was asked by the Palestine Liberation Organization to spend time with the PLO in exile in Tunis. He was actually asked by Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. And one of the other things that was interesting about Genet was his tendency toward betrayal, which was bound up in his own very unique idea of desire and politics. So he was invited to live with the PLO in exile in Tunis and to write a book, and because the PLO thought that he would write a sympathetic book to the Palestinian struggle. And Genet was very sympathetic to the Palestinian struggle and believed in self-determination for Palestinians. But he didn't write the book for like 12 years later. The interesting thing about the book is it records a very interesting development in that when Genet was living with the PLO in Tunis in exile, he was invited by the U.S. Black Panthers to do a fundraising tour for them somewhere in 1970, 1971. And so Genet had been barred from entering the United States and was not permitted to enter the United States for, I think, because of his attendance at the 1968 Democratic Political Convention in Chicago. He wrote an article that was very challenging of U.S. politics. And so he was banned from the United States. He snuck in to the United States and Canada, and then he went on a very public tour. He wasn't removed from the United States. And so this is a long way of saying that Larry and I shared a love for Genet because of his queerness, his perversity, his politics, and that particular moment where in U.S. history, where Black liberation and the Black Panthers embraced Jean Genet, a white, self-identified homosexual outlaw and thief, as someone who could help them in the struggle for liberation in the United States. And Larry and I would often talk about that. We talked about that book. Larry was doing research for a project, and he found somewhere, I don't know who, but someone in Chicago had a 16 millimeter film of Jean Genet giving a speech on behalf of the Black Panther Party at Yale University. And it was an amazing record, poorly shot. The person who was in the middle of the crowd and couldn't keep the camera straight, and you could only see Genet in the frame, but the audio was fantastic. And a Black Panther Party member, David Hilliard, who actually writes about it in his autobiography, was translating for Genet, because Genet didn't speak English very well. And Larry shared that footage with me because we just had this love, and we talked a lot about that moment in history and what an amazing conjuncture of history it was. There's a lot to say, and I'm not teaching class, and I don't want to go on and on and on, but it was just fascinating to us. The Black Panther Party was interesting for many, many reasons, and I'm sure there are people here who have studied the history of the Black Panther Party. One of the interesting aspects of the Black Panther Party is that they were very radical in terms of their sexual politics. So when Huey Newton was in prison, another leader of the Black Panther Party, he wrote a very famous essay for the Black Panther Party newspaper where he declared from prison that homosexuals were among the most oppressed groups in the United States. And so there was a link between Black liberation and gay liberation. And that's what Larry and I were interested in, basically, was this link and how there was a coalition or conjuncture of sexual politics and anti-colonial politics and Black liberation politics. And so to finish up, because I feel like I'm going on for a long time, that's what Larry and I were interested in these conjunctures, these places where the different liberation struggles found common points of agreement and came together in a movement that was much larger than the specific streams of liberation that were coursing around and through at the same time. I hope that was articulate enough and concise enough.
Yeah, it was Gregg. Yeah. I still love Jean Genet, be it from his adaptation or Fassbinder's adaptation of Querelle to Prisoners of Love and all of these things that you're mentioning. Think about memory and the way that Jenny, that is an important part of your collaborative project, I'm Still Surviving. Could you talk to us a little bit about this project, how memory folds into it, and also your research methodology around I'm Still Surviving?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks, Gregg, for that sort of context, especially about Chicago. I think people often think that New York and San Francisco are the main sites, and it's very clear that that's not the case. Chicago is a really important place to understand the history of HIV, and as I argue in I'm Still Surviving, but more importantly, as I was told by the women of I'm Still Surviving, Chicago is a really important place for the women's history of HIV, which is often not included in the history of HIV. And that's really what the project is about. The project is about talking to people who are living with HIV, talking to women who are living with HIV, and listening to them talk about what that means, what it means to be living with HIV, what it means to survive and thrive with HIV, what it means, what they had to go through to get to that point of survival. Not a simple story by any means. And the idea is really that women living with HIV are the best interviewers of other women living with HIV. It's not something that I mean, I'm trained in oral history. I know how to ask questions and listen to the answers, but the questions that I ask are never as good as the questions that they ask each other. So Debra's here tonight, and maybe she'll say some more about it, but I can't tell you how many times I've gone back and listened to Debra's interview. And she was being interviewed by someone who she's known for a long time, a woman named Marilyn, and you can hear them in a conversation, and they are able to ask each other and remember things for each other and say something that sparks a different kind of memory. And I could never ask those questions. And so part of what we tried to do was not just ask women to tell their stories, but to actually be the interpreters of those stories, to be the people who built the narratives that we then shared. And I have a very vivid memory of Debra saying, like, I want these stories to be everywhere. I want them to be in the Walgreens. I want them to be in the History Museum. I want them to be all around. And it's really stuck with me for a long time. We have, there are a lot of people who have incredible historical knowledge, and we need to be able to hear that and make space for it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. This is something that we'll talk about a little bit later, about the importance of writing down certain histories that have not been written about, or people who have been left out in the history of HIV and AIDS. But to turn our attention to Debra, Debra, we recently spoke about how in your lifetime you had 2 HIV diagnoses. One is when you learned you were positive after you had your very young daughter fell ill with the virus. And then the second one happened 5 years after you ended up in the penitentiary. Could you talk to us about your knowledge then about HIV and what kind of conversations were being had around this disease within the Black community?
I still really had no knowledge other than it was a gay white man's disease. I mean, we knew of the disease, but since none of us were gay or white, we really didn't believe that it affected us. And something Jenny just said really struck me really hard, and that was she knew, she's a historian, she knew the questions to ask. And that was the problem when I got my diagnosis. I didn't have any questions to ask the doctor. And on some level, she really didn't know any more than I did, because she didn't have any questions to ask me either, other than, is there anything that I can do for you? Well, what was I supposed to say? Because I didn't know anything. And she didn't know anything to ask me. So we were both there just dumbfounded and stuck. Me with the diagnosis and her with giving it out. We had nothing. And that's the way it was in our community. We had nothing other than the disease running rampant.
Yeah.
It was like being in a bubble, and every now and then you could just let a little air out, but the bubble would never go down.
Yeah, we'll get to talk about this a little bit later as well, too, in terms of why there wasn't a lot of knowledge around this disease, but also why it was called the gay white man's disease as well, too. But to go back to your project, Jenny, a little bit, reading through the Chicago, Brooklyn, Raleigh, Durham chapters of this project, I was struck by how women came to terms with their diagnosis at a time when they were either chronically homeless, which is something that Debra informed me about, or they were incarcerated. Some of them also transmitted the disease from their male partners. They didn't think that they would be affected by this disease because they weren't gay. Some of them also learned about the disease from gay men rather than doctors, because AIDS services organizations weren't attending to women. And so going back to the history of AIDS activism here in Chicago, who were and how were activist groups here in Chicago addressing the various forms of systematic violence or systemic violence that were affecting these women's lives?
Well, oh, go ahead, Deborah, you do it.
No, go ahead.
You.
Deborah, go ahead.
It was hard. A lot of women were being beaten, being kicked out of their homes. They were losing their children. Some of us were incarcerated. And again, we were getting these diagnoses. We had no way of knowing really what it was because the doctors didn't know. We'd come out of jail in the same position that we went into jail with nowhere to go. We were still homeless, riding that same wave. And then we got the alphabet people in our lives saying, okay, now you need to go into treatment. Well, what does that entail? So now we have the people who we were told that the disease belonged to, the gay white men, actually standing up for us saying, you've got to do something for these Black women. It's not just us who are actually affected. You know, they need treatment. They need housing. They need medications. You know, you've got to do something. And that's when, like, we actually found out that we didn't just have the flu. We weren't just ill per se. We were actually sick and dying. We didn't have what we were telling people, cancer. You know, and the irony of being in Chicago with HIV and AIDS was at Cook County Hospital, our HIV clinic was right around the corner down the hall from the Cancer Treatment Center. So there was a lot of irony in Black women being treated in Chicago.
Yeah, I just would add to that a little, or Deborah, were you done or no?
Yeah, I was done.
Okay. Deborah was part of a group of women who got care in a couple different places. One in the basement of Cook County in the radiation center, led by Marge Cohen, who is an internist and was trained at Rush in medicine in the 70s and then worked at Cook County, and created something called the Women and Children AIDS Program, AIDS Clinic in 1988. And there was also an entity called CWOP that maybe Deborah can talk a little bit about, Chicago Women's AIDS Project. There were protests by ACT UP in the 1980s about at Cook County, outside of Cook County. You know, there was no ward that could take care of women living with HIV until I think like 1989, 1990.
1990.
1990. So the way women who were experiencing this were made were made invisible is part of what was happening. People just didn't think that it mattered to them. And to Deborah's point, it is about medical racism. It's about structural violence and inequality. It's about incarceration. It's about the war on drugs. It's all of these things that are happening at the same time that make women's lives invisible, even as there's incredible activism going on by entities like ACT UP. Sometimes those two groups of women weren't together. I don't know, Deborah, did you have a sense of ACT UP when you were going to Radiation center?
No, not at all. The most that we kind of got a sense of ACT UP, excuse me, was actually them protesting in front of Cook County Hospital to actually get us off the ground. Actually getting test positive aware network started. They're who got us off the ground and running, got us started in the education department. We owe them our lives. Once they got us up and running, they kind of, I won't say faded, but they gave us what we needed. And for that, we're grateful. We kind of really didn't need any more. They kicked us in the butt and we ran. We just ran with it after that.
Debra, could you also talk about CWAP as well, how that was founded and some of the initiatives that CWAP does or did?
Chicago Women's AIDS Project started, I can't really speak to the history of how it started. I was too busy taking care of my brothers on the wards over at the hospital. Because back then, none of the nurses wanted to go in. So we had a wonderful director of programs, Phyllis Rogers, and she trained us to go in and take care of ourselves because nobody else would do it. So Chicago Women's AIDS Project came through and they set up groups where we could sit and talk about what ailed us and bring our children where they could play with other children who possibly had just what they had. And no one was worried about, I don't want my child playing with yours because your child has HIV. And we had positive groups and we had lunch and there was just a camaraderie there, and there was all sorts of information, and there were case managers there for housing, and just all kinds of information and support groups. And then there was a church next door that did all kinds of different things, and just a wealth of support. They set up the church at Halloween for the kids to go through. Then we came up with this idea for the theater and rap group because prevention was the key to everything. No matter what everybody was talking about abstinence, we all knew that abstinence wasn't the key. It was not happening. Okay. So we came up with, we had some singers in our group and some writers, and I've always been a talker. And we came up with the theater and rap group, and I sat on the prevention board group at downtown, and I also sat on the Title I group. And we wrote some grants, and we got them through, and we started going into the schools. We went wherever people would have us. We did our skits in churches, and we talked prevention. We passed out condoms where they would allow us to, and it was just a positive message. It was, there's no safe way to have sex. Period. That's it. That's all. You don't know where he is after he walks you to the door and walks away. You don't know what he's doing after he walks you to the door and walks away. It was a positive message. No safe way. Period. See what was a blessing to a lot of women. It got their rent paid. Kept a lot of women out of abusive relationships. It was one of the more positive organizations for women, period. Women, I mean, there were one or two men that came through CWAP, but it was an organization centered strictly on women. Didn't matter your nationality as long as you were female. Or I will say identified as female. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we took care of our own at CWAP.
Yeah, this was also the first support group for women living with AIDS and HIV.
HIV, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
As we're getting to hear how these histories from Chicago and New York met and mashed up here, Gregg, while members of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power were predominantly white gay men. Integrating women and people of color decentralize power and mobilize direct action into these various communities. Could you talk about some of the roles women had in ACT UP? Also, Black and Latinx people had in this group in accomplishing some of their missions? Oh, you're muted, Gregg.
Sure. First, it has to be said that AIDS is not and never was just a gay white man's disease. The fact that it was understood and recognized or misrecognized as a disease of gay white men exclusively had to do with the way that AIDS was first discovered. There were two early articles in the Center for Disease Control's monthly morbidity weekly report of cases of, I think, 5 self-identified homosexual men in New York and 5 in San Francisco. Dan will probably remember the specifics more accurately, but in one city, this cohort of homosexual white men had pneumocystis pneumonia, which was one of the leading opportunistic infections for wasn't named yet, but would be named gay-related immune deficiency. In San Francisco, I believe, it was cases of Kaposi sarcoma, which was also a very odd disease for a young group of men to be getting. It was a disease associated with older people, and it was a rare cancer. So, but what I'm saying is that what becomes gay-related immune deficiency, which is then identified as ARC and AIDS, age-related complex acquired immune deficiency, and then HIV when a virus is discovered, what was discovered in part and made visible by a medical surveillance system that caught a group of people who had access to medical care, which happened to be groups of gay white men on either coast. I'm not downplaying, I'm a queer person who's been living with HIV for, since I'm 23, for over 30, 35 years. But I'm not downplaying how devastating AIDS has been to queer people of all kinds. But I am saying that at the same time, now, if you look back at the medical reporting, there were huge cases of, in New York especially, there were huge cases of tuberculosis. There was an explosion of tuberculosis in the Bronx. And if you look back at the epidemiology, it was clear that that was also an opportunistic infection caused by immune compromise. And that was largely happening among communities of color, Black and brown communities. So, and also one of the earliest groups that were identified or misidentified as being at-risk groups were Haitians. Again, because the way in which medical surveillance shaped how AIDS was understood. And so the picture of what AIDS was created also through tremendous amounts of stigma. It was convenient in a white supremacist society, a sexist society, to see AIDS as something outside of what was called a general public. But in a white supremacist society, in a patriarchal society, the general public is understood to be largely white and largely male. And so anyone who falls outside of that was perceived as a threat, as a vector of disease. And so there was homophobia, sexism, and racism was also shaping a picture of the disease as the most vulnerable groups, the groups disproportionately affected, who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer people of color, drug using, incarcerated, poor, women identified. There was this kind of perfect storm where prejudice was able to shape a picture of the disease and also allow a right-wing government to try to ignore the problem and take historically ostracized groups and make them fall outside the identification of the general public. The general public, very quickly and succinctly, and because Dan has his hand up, the general public is a group of people that's organized to buy things. And it's not insignificant that the first time I saw a picture of a person with AIDS on a subway platform, not produced by a group of activists like myself who were making images of people with AIDS for ourselves and our communities, was by a drug company. The first time that people with AIDS enter into the visual field of advertising is when there's something very expensive to sell to us at a very high price. So this is like 1996. I'm standing on the Five Corners on the it's on the Blue Line. What stop is that?
Milwaukee.
Yeah, I'm Milwaukee, I guess, and I'm looking at a poster of a muscle-bound white guy climbing a mountain, and it's like like an advertisement for like one of the drugs, the earliest drugs, and that's it was the drug that I was on. I'm fortunate. The only reason I'm alive, I didn't do anything different than my friends, is just luck and privilege. I had access to Medicare. But that struck me, like I'm looking at a billboard that's selling a product that's keeping me alive, and that's like my first encounter in the general media where people with AIDS all of a sudden are being addressed as consumers.
Yeah, Debra, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, as far as the stigma went with the gay white men, even in my community, even though we were sharing syringes, the fact that none of us were affiliated with gay white men, we weren't worried about it because none of us were involved with gay white men. So, that just wasn't an issue. And we continue to, share those syringes, and when we got new ones, we used the new ones. But it was crazy. And then to equate the way people with AIDS looked with the way folks that smoke crack looked just made it all the more worse. It was crazy.
And there were divisions within the activist groups. I'm thinking, Deborah, you're making me think. In ACT UP, it was a big debate in New York. I was also part of the group of people who founded the Lower East Side Needle Exchange Project, and I was part of a group of people in ACT UP who actually went to jail for handing out sterile hypodermic needles on Delancey and Essex, which is downtown in New York. And because it was illegal to have syringes in New York at the time. So we decided to, because there was plenty of evidence from around the world that needle exchange programs saved lives. So we went to jail for doing that, and we actually won the case, and syringes were made legal in New York. But that was a huge fight, even within ACT UP. I say even, as if it's a surprise. ACT UP was a group of largely gay white men who were also drug users. I was a drug user as well as being queer, but a lot of people wanted to keep those two groups separate. I gave a speech on the floor of ACT UP and then later in front of City Hall where I posed the question, who are the fags and who are the junkies? Some of us are both. And yeah, so I just wanted to, I'm just hearing you, Deborah, and identifying, because it was even among the groups of people who were hardest hit by AIDS, we had to learn the lessons of intersectionality. And you asked how women and drug users and people of color were involved in the activist movements. The histories that are unfolding now should reflect, and some do and some don't, actually the great diversity of people. So New York and Chicago shared one of the greatest AIDS activists of all time. And his name just flew out of my head just because I'm sad.
Danny
I'm sorry.
Sotomayor.
Danny
Sotomayor.
Ortiz.
Oh.
Danny Sotomayor and also Ortiz Alderson.
Absolutely.
Ortiz Alderson was from Chicago, but he was in New York being an actor, and he was a major figure. Ortiz and I did a lot of work together in ACT UP New York, and then Ortiz and his husband moved back to Chicago, and Ortiz was active when he moved back to Chicago. Then unfortunately, Ortiz Alderson died. But Ortiz was a Black activist, had been involved with the Black liberation movement in the 70s and the gay liberation movement in the 70s, and brought a lot of experience and knowledge to the AIDS activist movement. We all looked up to him, and he and I were in the same affinity group together, and he taught us a lot about activism.
And now we have Mike Pence, who wants to be president, who doesn't believe in the science, and that is a positive after the damage he inflicted on Indiana when he refused to open the needle exchange program over there. So there you go.
Well, I'm very appreciative of the two of you bringing these histories to you. And even as we're talking, the intersections of race and gender become more apparent and so visible and clear cut. When you were talking about the consequences of living in a white patriarchal society and the effects that has on other bodies, Gregg, it reminds me of also the role that ACT UP had in making sure that women were also participating in clinical trials, critical drug trials, and how at the time the government wouldn't allow, or the CDC wouldn't allow women to go under clinical drug trials because of their childbearing potential. And so just to turn to Dan a little bit, Dan, I'd love to hear when and how you became involved with HIV research and treatment, and also what was happening at the time in the medical industry. And I mean this time when Gregg and Debra are also talking about it too. Oh, it's the FDA. Yes, the FDA. Just a correction there. What was happening at the time in the medical industry?
Well, how I got involved with AIDS and HIV research is, you have to remember that in the 1980s and up till 1988, there was absolutely no treatment for people that were HIV infected. There's nothing, zero. And only until 1988, when AZT got approved, it was only approved for people with advanced disease, for people whose T-cell counts were very low. So, you couldn't even get a doctor perhaps to even prescribe it for you who were HIV infected, which was just, appalling. But as part of my medical education, something that was very unusual for a medical student to do is I supplemented my medical education with research. So I spent a year at Downstate Medical Center in New York in the Department of Transplant Surgery, learning clinical research and transplant. I spent another year in the Department of Endocrinology at Loyola. I had my own rat lab. I was studying metabolic aberrations in diabetes. I spent a summer in pathology. I did a lot of very unusual things for medical students. So by the time I graduated medical school in the 80s, I actually had a background in clinical research. And so, when AIDS was hitting our community and hitting my tribe, I felt that since there was no treatments available, that I sort of pivoted and changed my specialty and decided to go into treating my community. And so I began to start, as someone with a background, I began to use whatever information I learned in terms of whatever had a scientific basis to construct treatment, possible potential treatment for HIV. I wanted to begin projects. And so I became widely known immediately as combining, as doing the first study of combining two antiretroviral agents in the world. And DDI wasn't even approved yet. And I got it through the expanded access program and put my patients on lower doses of both of them. They're both quite toxic, but used them together. And I even added, in some cases, compound Q. It was an underground drug that I was working with Martin Delaney at the time in San Francisco and Jim Cordy from Los Angeles, and working with other activists. But I started, and I got noticed by pharmaceutical companies, especially when I presented my work in World AIDS in 1992. That year was in Amsterdam. And I became noticed, and pharmaceutical companies that were looking to do research in that area, I was starting to get phone calls. And immediately I became well-known within the pharmaceutical industry. I got involved on multiple research projects. I was bringing them to Chicago because, if you remember in the late 80s, there was only 2 clinical research projects going on at Northwestern. Both of them were failed drugs. They didn't go anywhere. They were useless. There was really not much going on. And so I set up a clinic. I set up the first community-based research clinic here in Chicago, and was bringing a lot of trials to Chicago. So, along with that, it's a very personal experience, but I still continue to network with AIDS activists. So I was working with scientists within the pharmaceutical industry, and even getting to know people like Tony Fauci and people within government. But that's that's my personal introduction into the field. But I guess your second part of the question was, I don't remember, Denny, what your second
So my second part of the question was, what was happening? I asked what was happening at the time in the medical industry, but what were some catalysts that ushered in women's inclusion in clinical trials for antiretroviral treatments and HIV treatments?
Well, you have to know that, first of all, there was significant numbers of women that were activists at the time, and they were influential because they came from previous feminist movements of the 60s and 70s. And a lot of them I would call, I don't know if you can call them professional activists, but they definitely had experience. And they were not just in New York, but there were some in Chicago, there was some in California, but and a lot of them have become very well known. But women were mistreated by government agencies and pharmaceutical companies doing research, and they used an excuse. The excuse was the thalidomide debacle, that babies developed birth defects when mothers were put on thalidomide back in the day. And they used that excuse to disallow women from participating in studies. Also, women, I was seeing women in the clinic, and I was noticing, along with my colleagues, that the manifestations of HIV and AIDS among women were very different than male counterparts. women were developing recurrent pelvic inflammatory disease issues, a lot of vaginal infections. They were developing. They were a greater risk for cervical cancer. They had problems with recurrent pneumonia. They were developing wasting as well. But a lot of women, because the CDC failed to recognize or refused to recognize these manifestations as AIDS defining, they couldn't qualify or wouldn't qualify for social services, so they couldn't get food or help at home. A lot of them were dying of malnutrition because they didn't have money to put food on the table, let alone to get signed up with whatever other programs were available for males. And so women activists in the around probably late 80s or early 90s, they started creating their own groups. And a lot of them also became members of ACT UP. And then at one point, there was some conference, I think in 1990, it was a Women's and AIDS conference. Maybe Gregg might remember what that was called, but I think that actually was in Washington, D.C. And they wrote a treatment agenda for women, in fact. And then they forced Tony Fauci to attend that. But Tony Fauci at one point said that he didn't know anything about AIDS and women. I think he just denied the fact that there was any information about AIDS in women, and that was the excuse that he used to not look at these manifestations that women were dealing with. But eventually, and I don't know exactly what developed eventually that led to the CDC finally seeing reality, but eventually they did, and eventually women did get access to clinical trials, and eventually women, eventually those diagnoses became AIDS-defining diagnoses, so women would be able to get access to social services as well as treatment.
Yeah, Jenny, go ahead.
Thanks. I might narrate the story a little differently, Dan, to say a couple things. One is, I think what's really important, and part of what I heard Debra saying, is that I think the way we talk about ACT UP as the driving force of all AIDS, of all transformations in the AIDS epidemic, does a disservice to a group of people who didn't find themselves in that space. For a whole host of reasons. And I think it's important to name that that there were incredible women, lesbian, feminist activists who were part of ACT UP. And then there were a range of women who were affected and living with HIV who ACT UP didn't exist for them. They had to struggle in other ways that were entirely unrelated to what was happening in ACT UP. And I think it's just important to sort of name that both of those things are true. And to then also say that both of those sets of people, which was sometimes overlapping, but not always, were at the forefront of actually forcing the changes that you have described. One of them is, of course, the Change the Definition protest that was a national campaign that lasted for 2 or 3 years. I think it started in 1989, maybe in 1990, and finally culminated in the federal government changing the definition of AIDS to include opportunistic infections such as cervical cancer. But that also meant that many MDs needed to learn how to do cervical exams when they hadn't, in fact, ever done them before and didn't think that that was important. So that work, which is led by women living with HIV and unfortunately also dying from complications related to AIDS, people like Iris de la Cruz and Katrina Haslip in New York, in organization with and in work with Terry McGovern. I just I think it's important to sort of name that it wasn't just women alone. Many men in ACT UP sort of talked about and remembered that as one of the most sort of coalition building moments across many different parts of ACT UP. And then, of course, there is also, which we should talk about, the 076 trial, the trial to intervene, to figure out whether it was possible to intervene in maternal to fetal transmission. And it's a long history, and it's a huge study, and it's on the one hand incredibly, I think, controversial, and it causes lots of schisms inside of ACT UP. And there are questions about what it means to have pregnant women in clinical trials when the goal is about the fetus and not about the woman. But it's also very clear that I would argue that the 076 trial is the first trial, among the first trials, to get us to PrEP, to get us to something called treatment as prevention, because it is the idea that the pregnant woman will take AZT in some, and the first doses were obscene, but will take AZT or now other antiretrovirals, and it will prevent transmission. So women living with HIV are those people who do that work, and they do it at Downstate, and they do it at Cook County, and they do it at Harlem Hospital, and they do it in Newark, and they do it in Miami and in all of these places. So I think it's really an important part of the entire history that doesn't often get talked about, because it doesn't fit into the norms that we have decided are going to narrate how we understand what made change happen.
Yeah. Demystifying all these histories related to activism, treatment, research, makes me also think about, as you were talking, Gregg, it reminded me of, I had a conversation early on in the summer with Lorelei, and I was talking to her about how it is mostly my women identifying friends who know more about PrEP and like HIV treatment in comparison to mostly my straight male friends. And I wasn't sure why this was until Debra mentioned to me that it's because women today have, control over their bodies. They're not just being given medicine to just take care of it. They have more control over their health. And so as we're talking about this too, I'm wondering, what was also happening globally as well too? This is a question directly to you, Dan. What was happening also globally when it came to research about treatment, treatment that was efficient to people living with HIV, and not just from like a US perspective? What was happening in South Africa? What was happening in Haiti or elsewhere?
That's a great question, but not easy to answer, because even in the United States, there were populations of individuals that didn't have equal access to medications as everyone else. So, and we saw that repeated in COVID, in fact. So, although in the Western world, medications became accessible, it wasn't completely accessible to everyone. So, yes, research continued, and eventually in 1995, we saw the results of what the protease inhibitors was doing, and in terms of reducing HIV viral load levels and getting people's immune systems to recover. And we saw that the prevalence of opportunistic infections and death was dropping very quickly, but they were still a large gap within the African American population here in the United States. Life expectancy for African Americans was still at least 20 years lower than for their Caucasian counterparts, as well as for other communities of color. Although in Europe and Western Europe, treatment became available and as well, and but South America, Latin America, there were differences because the system of medical care, socialized medicine, there had to be negotiations between governments and pharmaceutical companies to get treatments at a discount. Then you saw Africa. In some countries like South Africa, treatment became eventually more widely available, but then you saw other countries in Africa, obviously, that still today, there are large populations. I was in Zimbabwe last year, in fact, and there are some communities where half the population is HIV positive. It's still extremely troubling. But I think globally, from the mid-90s on, treatments improved. In the very beginning, we had protease inhibitors that were very toxic and they were causing lots of complications. Although we were able to administer those medications to people, they still were taking them in combination with other medications, and all of them had their toxicities. But pharmaceutical companies were in competition with each other, and they wanted to sell more of their medications, so they strove to develop better agents, better medications, to the point where today we have much more patient-friendly medications. People are able to take their medications with very little or no side effects in most situations, and people that are HIV positive can live a normal life expectancy. But as I go back to what I said earlier, there are still communities of color, and there's still a large gap, even in this country as well as other places, where not everyone has the same access to medications, where people are being ostracized in their communities. There's still a lot of issues that we haven't dealt with properly.
Gregg, go ahead.
Oh, Dan kind of brought it to the point where I wanted to weigh in. I'll just throw some more things in that I think are important. It's true to say that the AIDS crisis is still beginning. It's far from over. AIDS activism it's important to understand AIDS activism in its broadest definition, as Jenny is saying. Was very successful. Currently, there are around 35 million people in the world with HIV. Only somewhere between a half and 2/3 of people who have HIV have access to the life-saving drugs that are keeping me alive. So that means that a third of that 35 million do not have access. Access has been severely compromised. There's been a ceiling reached on the amount of funding that's going to global AIDS due to global racial capitalism, but also the many crises, overlapping crises. COVID actually prevented the circulation of HIV drugs when supply lines and supply chains were challenged, so in the United States, there's a split between the northern United States and the southern United States, which mirrors the split between the global north and the global south in terms of access. But within the United States and around the world, there are still, as Dan pointed out, many people and rates of infection of HIV that are the same in various pockets and countries as the beginning of the HIV crisis. In the United States, it's very hard to get PrEP in the South, for example. It's very hard to get PrEP in states that did not adopt or put federal funds toward providing drugs to people with AIDS. It's very uneven in the United States, where federal monies were then distributed by states toward care, and the ways in which states went about providing care is a much larger conversation. All I'm saying is that actually, I get to a point, I have a lot of these conversations, and I'm very honored and happy to be here. But I often get frustrated because it's not, talking in the past is very important, because we're at this juncture where it's important to understand the history of HIV. But I and many others and other people here are still living with the organ damage of having been lucky enough to get access to AZT when we were taking 4 times the dose that was eventually decided upon to be the clinical dose. I'm glad there are drugs that are far more user friendly now, but it produces a dissonance for me, because I know that HIV is still affecting millions of people, that millions of people still don't have access to drugs that are keeping people like me alive, who has had the privilege and luck to have access in this country as well as around the world. And homophobia, sexism, and racism still are the driving forces behind those inequalities, as well as the mechanics of capitalism. COVID is not like HIV at all, really. COVID is far more transmissible. HIV is actually relatively hard to get compared to COVID, but there is a connection between the two epidemics, and that is, or pandemics, because AIDS actually is a pandemic. It even qualifies for that word in terms of the sheer number of people who've been infected and died from it. Is that the issue of patents, drug production, generic drug production, the ownership of intellectual property, and the ways in which that trials and drugs that work are distributed are still very much at issue. You have that, you see Moderna is going to raise the price on the COVID injection now. The promise that President Biden did say that the formulas for COVID drugs would be shared, kind of citing a precedent that of the success of the AIDS activist movement, which did in fact defeat the World Trade Organization. The South African activists in the early 2000s applied, seized the moral high ground and actually got 40 North American and European pharmaceutical companies to withdraw a lawsuit against generic production and buying drugs cheaply on the open market around the world. That came out of the South African AIDS activists, largely led that. Zaki Ahmed was one of the most famous faces for that. Anyway, I can go on and on. It drives me a little bit crazy. I'm not angry at anyone here. I want you all to understand I'm just an angry person, angry at the situation, and it's not over.
Yeah, it isn't. It also reminds me that I recently, maybe it was last year when I lost my insurance and I needed to get on PrEP, I learned that I couldn't get Truvada. I had to get the generic PrEP. And also, I was able to get the generic PrEP because the patent for Truvada had just ended, and now they were making it available to everyone. And now that we're speaking about bodies and infections, I mean, as we have, I'm also thinking about the need for bodies to be corrected as something that is so dominant and ingrained in dominant culture. And in your essay, Gregg, Dense Moments, which comes from your book, The AIDS Crisis is Still Beginning, or is Still Happening, you start off by saying, I'm sick. I don't want a cure. I like my illness. It's just as much a part of me as any other characteristic. I identify as my illness. Today, I feel relatively fine. Probably won't see 30. Living with the infection, me, and millions of other people worldwide. I have a disease an infection that horrifies the uninfected for two reasons. First, there is no cure. Second, the routes of transmission are well known: sex, intravenous drugs, pregnancy, mother to child, life-affirming things. The kind of things people have guilt about regardless of their association with this disease. And so I've been reading this book for like the past year. It's been very crucial to just my understanding of your work and also what was happening in the 80s and the 90s. And I sense a lot of immediacy and uncertainty about mortality and life pleasures. And as you've gotten to see your 30s and lived for 5+ decades, I'm curious to hear how or if your thoughts about aging have changed.
Yes and no. I'm constantly in the past. I don't know. I when I talk, I can only report anecdotally that when I talk with my friends who have HIV and who are still alive, that we've all responded differently. But there's, you just don't move on. I just haven't moved on. I mean, it's not like I can move on. This is my life, and it's preoccupied me, and I've committed myself to activism, and so that's why I would make this kind of assertion or intervention that the AIDS crisis is still beginning. Something I wanted to say before that I didn't say, but I still feel has to be part of the conversation, is that HIV is one of the leading causes of death for women around the world today. But the majority of the women that constitute that statistic live in Central Africa, but not entirely. Actually, AIDS disproportionately affects women globally today. And that's also true in the pockets of infection in the United States as well. That it is men who have sex with other men. Gay, it's interesting. I don't use gay interchangeably with, say, men who have sex with other men or other identities, because actually gay identity is largely a class identity. Not entirely, but there are a lot of people who have all different kinds of sex who don't necessarily identify with these terms, which again are largely developed because of access, privilege, and class. In the 80s, we had to produce different terms, like men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women, injection drug users. We had to come up with terms that describe behaviors rather than identities. I had plenty of lovers, male lovers. I lived in Chelsea. I was a Chelsea queen, but I had plenty of lovers who lived in the boroughs, and they really enjoyed coming to visit me in Chelsea because it was like a privilege. Like, we could walk down the street holding hands. In the gayborhood, you could look sick and no one would ostracize you. You could go into a restaurant, get your hair cut. No one was afraid of touching you because you looked sick. But even terms like that, which is not a common term, it's a term I use with my friends, but you probably heard it, right? The gayborhood, the gay neighborhood, which is really a real estate category, not a sexual identity. Anyway, it's very complex. I got a little lost here, but it's very complex. But Larry understood it. Just to get back to Larry really understood a lot of the complexities of living with HIV, queerness, and ostracization and prejudice, and you saw it in his work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Maybe Debra would be willing to answer that same question.
Yeah.
It would be a really interesting, it would just be interesting to hear her talk about it also.
Yeah.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah. You've gotten to have grandkids. You've gotten to live with HIV, which you said definitely saved your life, since it was a way to get sober. It was a way to get your daughter back into custody and also not die. I'd just love to hear how or if your thoughts about aging have changed.
I definitely, I'm glad to be of old age. Um, and definitely this is my third epidemic pandemic. I've lived through crack. Still living with HIV and AIDS. Lived through COVID. Don't know how they've classified monkeypox, but I'm getting through that and I'm ready for the next one. I'm not planning on going anywhere. I've got, I don't know, 12, 13 grandkids and looking forward to see all of them graduate. I'm somebody who they thought would never live to see 21. I've done that 3.5 times now. Well, 2.5 times anyway. I love being old. Looking forward to fishing with my hat on and not being bothered. And as I tell my kids, the older I get, the more people can just kiss my ass. So, yeah, I love it.
Thank you, Debra. Thank you.
Getting old.
So I'll open it up to the audience for a couple of questions. I see that we're near time. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or just unmute. Yeah, Nika.
Hi, I'm really sorry. I'm like kind of at an event while I'm listening to you, so I hope there's not too much background noise. But I've been following first Sarah Schulman's work for ever since like I graduated college. And right now I'm trying to report on the pandemic. And I contracted HPV-18. I do not have HIV or AIDS. And but I have re-engaged with HIV, like the history of HIV and AIDS through the science. And I just have a question. Deaths are categorized as HIV-related when a lot of the symptoms that are being named as afflicting women are actually seem to me to be being caused by another virus, HPV, while HIV/AIDS is attacking the immune system. Does that seem wacky to anyone?
I guess I could try to answer that question from a clinical standpoint. So you're talking about death. So I think it's up to the physician to decide on the death certificate what the cause of death is. So when I sometimes am seeing one of my patients, and if the unfortunate happens and someone dies, I may make a judgment that they died of AIDS, even if they didn't die of an AIDS-defining illness. And I will often do that just to document the fact that people have been suffering with HIV and AIDS, and maybe that their death isn't directly, but I always feel that there's always a real thread that I can see between HIV and whatever they died of. So sometimes I will list that as diagnosis, or often I will list that as a diagnosis, but it's up to the physician. Obviously HPV causes cancer, and if somebody dies of HPV-related cancer, maybe the number one cause of death on the death certificate will be, say, if it's cervical cancer, it's cervical cancer, but underneath that, the physician has the ability to say acquired, they could say HIV infection as a result of, or contributed by HIV infection, et cetera. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it's helpful. I saw something about how cervical cancer was, it's not at this panel, but at a panel on the criminalization last week, on the criminalization of AIDS, cervical cancer, it wasn't until like some date in the 90s that cervical cancer was listed as a symptom of AIDS, when like all of the literature I'd been seeing about HPV said that HPV is the cause of like something like 98% of the cervical cancers documented nationwide. So, and there's quite a lot of literature that's also tracking HPV remission and clearance in people who are and aren't infected with HIV. So I don't understand why those two viruses would be conflated when, like you know, like from a kind of sexual liberation perspective.
Yeah, well, they are two different viruses, and they do, you know, it's like you're saying, it's not always clear cut, because if you're HIV positive, you're at a higher risk for developing certain cancers, and the cancers that people at high risk for are generally related to another infection. So just like liver cancer could be caused by hepatitis, if you're HIV positive, you'd have a higher incidence or a higher chance of getting that kind of cancer, because it's a cancer related to infection. The same for cervical cancer, because it's HPV related. There's a higher incidence of complications due to HPV among people that are HIV positive. So as I was saying, I see the threads, and I always consider myself an AIDS activist, and so I will put acquired immune deficiency or HIV infection on the death certificate of anyone that dies of it and has HIV, because I want it documented.
Thank you so much. That's it.
Anyone with a question, just raise your hand or unmute.
I don't know. I have HPV. I did have Hep C, but it cleared itself. And I also have COPD. And as somebody who's lived with HIV since '85, I think if I expired from COPD complications, I would prefer that you did that versus me dying from AIDS. Because my friends and I've always said it won't be HIV that kills us. So if it's not the AIDS that kills me, I would prefer that you not put that on my death certificate.
Good to know.
I think that's a really powerful thing to say, and part of what, you know, I guess thinking about the HPV and HIV connection that Nika asked about is also, you know, the cervix is not something that a lot of infectious disease doctors want to know anything about. Not even all gynecologists want to know about the cervix. And women are more than their cervix is, but only people assigned female at birth have cervixes. So it's a complicated it's a complicated picture. And
tell it to Congress.
What? Tell it to Congress. Yeah,
tell it to Congress.
Right. And I think the other thing that's very clear to me, and I thought when Gregg said this, like when he talked about saying on the floor of ACT UP, who are the junkies and who are the faggots, it's such a powerful point, is that people live much more complicated lives than we ever really talk about. We live more complicated lives sexually. We live more complicated lives in terms of how and when and in what ways we use drugs, how and when and in what way we don't have access to the things that we need, whether it's food or housing or what it means to lose our kids or anything like that. And just as we know that health is more than the absence of disease, you know, we also just, I think it's really important to name that that biomedicine is never going to be the thing that actually ultimately makes us all well. We need a lot more than that. Even as biomedicine is the thing currently keeping many people alive, there's the reality that people don't have access to it, but also that biomedicine alone doesn't make us well.
That's absolutely true. I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Debra. Thank you, Gregg and Dan. This has been such a lovely evening of conversation. And thanks to our audience for being with us tonight. I see that Matthew Gulish is here as well too. Thank you, Matthew, for really allowing for this to happen as well with Lynn Hickson and Caroline Picard. Thank you all. I hope whoever's here is able to see the exhibition before it closes on Saturday. We'll be open from 12 to 5. But other than that, thank you again and have a good night.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Of course.
Night.
This was fantastic. Thank you.
Good night.